Welcome back to. We are often taught to see hospitals as sanctuaries of healing, bastions of science and compassion where life, in all its fragility, is held sacred above all else. They are places of trust, where we put our lives and the lives of our loved ones into the hands of trained caregivers. But in our exploration of the darker, more shadowed territories of the human psyche, we know that even the most trusted hands can harbor the most terrifying of intentions. The starched white uniform of a caregiver can sometimes be the most effective disguise for a predator. Before we enter the sterile, quiet corridors of St. Jude's Mercy Hospital, a place where a series of unexplained and peaceful deaths is about to unravel a horrifying, long-hidden secret, I invite you to become a part of our community of investigators. If you are compelled by the intricate, psychological puzzles that lie behind the most shocking and counterintuitive crimes, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Your support is what ensures that we can continue to shine a bright, unflinching light into these shadowed corners of the world. Tonight, we tell the story of a dedicated, beloved nurse, a woman known to all as an angel of mercy. This is the story of how she used her profound knowledge of medicine to become a silent, undetectable killer, and how her long, dark reign was brought to an end by a single, carelessly overlooked object, a hidden medicine bottle. The fourth floor of St. Jude's Mercy Hospital existed in a state of hushed, reverent quiet. It was a place apart from the frantic, clattering energy of the rest of the hospital. There were no triumphant recovery stories here, no celebratory balloons tied to bedposts. This was the palliative care unit, a wing dedicated not to the desperate, beeping struggle for life, but to the gentle, dignified management of its final, inevitable chapter. The staff who chose to work here were a special breed, a unique mixture of profound, almost bottomless empathy and a stoic, quiet resilience. And among this elite cadre of caregivers, Nurse Catherine Hayes was universally considered a saint. At 34, Catherine possessed a serene, almost ethereal beauty that seemed perfectly suited to her role. With her soft, compassionate brown eyes that seemed to hold a universe of understanding, her gentle, confident hands, and a voice that was a low, soothing melody capable of calming the most agitated of souls, she was more than a nurse. She was an institution. The families of her patients, in their letters of gratitude to the hospital administration, rarely used her professional title. They called her their angel of mercy. She was the one who would sit, often for hours on her own time, with a patient who had no family. She was the one who could coax a final, precious smile from a face etched with pain. She seemed to possess an almost supernatural, sixth sense for a patient's needs: a sip of water, an extra pillow, a moment of quiet companionship before those needs were even spoken. She was beloved by her colleagues who saw her as the gold standard of their profession, revered by the hospital administration who saw her as the shining star of their palliative care program, and worshipped by the families who entrusted the final, sacred moments of their loved ones to her care. The first death, therefore, was not in itself an alarm bell. In a palliative care unit, death was the expected daily outcome. Mr. Alistair Finch, an 89-year-old retired history professor with end-stage pancreatic cancer, a man whose body was riddled with a pain that even the most potent opiates could barely touch, passed away peacefully in his sleep. Nurse Hayes had been with him. She had been adjusting his morphine drip and had stayed with him, holding his thin, papery hand as his breathing grew shallow and finally, gently ceased. His family, who had been racked with guilt over not being there in his final moment, was profoundly, tearfully grateful for her presence, for the peaceful, painless end she had helped to provide. It was, in the unique and somber lexicon of the fourth floor, a good death. The second death, 3 weeks later, was also, on its surface, unremarkable. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a 76-year-old former opera singer with congestive heart failure, a woman whose once powerful lungs had been reduced to a fragile, gurgling whisper, also passed away in the middle of the night. Her chart noted a sudden, but not entirely unexpected, cardiac arrest. Once again, Catherine Hayes had been the attending nurse. She had been the last person to check on her, to fluff her pillow and offer a kind word that had calmed her patient's escalating anxiety. Her family, too, sent a glowing, effusive letter to the hospital, praising the angel who had made their vibrant mother's final moments so serene and dignified. It was the third death, a month after that, a death that should have been just another sad, quiet note in the fourth floor's daily symphony of loss, that finally, quietly, tripped a wire in the sharp, analytical mind of Dr. Lena Petrova. Dr. Petrova was the head of the unit, a brilliant, no-nonsense physician in her late 40s who had dedicated her life to the complex science and delicate art of palliative medicine. The patient was a man named Marcus Thorne, a 58-year-old former construction worker with ALS. His powerful, muscular body had been cruelly, progressively betrayed by his own nervous system, but his mind was sharp, his spirit defiant, and his prognosis, while ultimately terminal, had been stable for months. His passing was abrupt, a sudden, catastrophic respiratory failure that took even the seasoned, unflappable Dr. Petrova completely by surprise. And as she stood in the quiet, dimly lit room, signing the death certificate, a small, cold knot of professional unease began to form in the pit of her stomach. The common denominator for all three of these unexpected, yet remarkably peaceful, deaths was the same. They had all occurred on a Tuesday night. They had all occurred during the shift of their most beloved, most dedicated, and most infallible nurse, Catherine Hayes. Dr. Petrova was a woman of science, of data, not of superstition or morbid coincidence. She tried to dismiss the thought as a product of the immense stress and emotional fatigue that came with her job. But the thought, once planted in the fertile ground of her analytical mind, refused to be uprooted. It began to grow, to twist, to send out dark, speculative tendrils. That evening, after a long and grueling shift, she did something she had never done before. She went to the hospital's records department and began, in her spare time, to discreetly review the charts of every patient who had died on the fourth floor over the past year. A pattern began to emerge, faint and ghostly at first, then sharpening with each file she examined into a horrifying, statistically undeniable reality. Over the last 18 months, there had been a statistically significant, almost impossible spike in patient deaths on Tuesday and Thursday nights. These were, she confirmed, the 2 nights a week that Catherine Hayes worked the quiet, understaffed night shift. The deaths were always peaceful, always officially attributed to the patient's underlying Candida sudden cardiac event, a respiratory failure, a blood clot, but they were often accelerated. Patients who were expected to live for weeks, even months, patients whose families had just been told to prepare for a long, slow decline, would suddenly, serenely pass away under Catherine's exemplary care. Dr. Petrova felt a sickening, physical lurch in her gut. She felt as though the solid ground of her professional world was crumbling beneath her feet. The implications were monstrous, unthinkable, a violation of everything she held sacred. She was looking at the ghost of a pattern that pointed to the one person in the entire hospital no one would ever, under any circumstances, suspect. She knew she couldn't go to the hospital administration, to the board of directors, with something so circumstantial, so potentially slanderous. They would protect their star nurse, their angel of mercy. They would, more than likely, question Dr. Petrova's own stability, her fitness to lead the department. She needed an outside perspective. She needed someone who was paid to believe the unbelievable. She needed a cop. That cop was Detective Frank Harding. He was an old, distant friend of her husband's, a man with a city-wide reputation for being a quiet, dogged, and deeply cynical investigator. He was a homicide detective who had seen too much to believe in saints, and who instinctively understood that the most pristine surfaces often hid the most profound rottenness. He met Dr. Petrova for coffee in a small, out-of-the-way cafe in a part of the city far from the hospital, a place of cracked linoleum and the smell of burnt coffee. He listened, his face an impassive, unreadable mask, as she laid out her findings, her voice a low, trembling whisper, as if she were afraid to give voice to the monstrous theory that had taken root in her mind. "I know it sounds crazy, Frank," she concluded, her hands wrapped so tightly around her cold coffee cup that her knuckles were white. "Catherine is. She is the best, most compassionate nurse I have ever worked with. She's a pillar of this hospital. But the numbers, the goddamn numbers, they don't lie. Something is terribly, terribly wrong on my floor. Harding was a man who trusted numbers far more than he trusted people. What Dr. Petrova was describing was a classic, terrifying angel of death scenario. One of the most difficult, insidious, and psychologically complex types of serial crime to prove. The killers were often masters of manipulation, hiding their crimes behind a flawless mask of compassion. Their murder weapon the very trust and authority that was placed in them. Harding and his partner, a sharp, tech-savvy young detective named Maria Chun, opened a discreet, off-the-books inquiry. They couldn't storm the hospital with a search warrant or start official interviews. The political and media fallout would be catastrophic, and it would tip off their suspect immediately. They had to move like ghosts, gathering evidence from the periphery, building a case from the shadows. They started with the victims. They began the delicate, heartbreaking work of re-interviewing the grieving families of the recent deceased, under the guise of a quality of care review being conducted by the city. The response was unanimous and, to Harding, utterly damning. Nurse Hayes was a saint, a godsend, an angel. Their stories, meant to be glowing testimonials to her kindness, became, in Harding's cynical and experienced mind, a litany of bright, flashing red flags. Catherine was always the one to predict a patient's imminent passing, often telling the family, with a sad, knowing look, that their loved one wouldn't make it through the night. She was always the one to find the body. She was always the one to comfort the family in the aftermath, her grief seeming as profound and genuine as their own. She was not just a caregiver. She was the master of ceremonies for the entire, sacred ritual of death. She was the star of the show. Chun began to build a deep psychological profile of their suspect. Catherine Hayes's life on the surface was one of quiet, almost monastic, selfless dedication. She was unmarried, lived alone in a small, tidy apartment in a nondescript building, and seemed to have no social life outside of the hospital. Her colleagues described her as intensely private but universally kind. She was a nurse's nurse, the one they all aspired to be. But Chun, digging deeper into her past, found a more troubling, tragic history. Catherine's mother had died after a long, painful, and agonizing battle with cancer when Catherine was just a teenager. Her father, a man from whom she had been estranged, had committed suicide 2 years later. She was a woman intimately, profoundly acquainted with death and loss. Was her work a noble way of processing her own trauma, of giving to others the peace she could not give her own mother? Or had it become something far more twisted? Was she ending her patient's suffering? Or was she addicted to the power, the control, the godlike authority of deciding when their lives should end? Harding knew that psychology and statistics would never be enough to secure a conviction. He needed hard, physical evidence. The problem was the murder weapon itself. An experienced, intelligent nurse would know exactly what to use a substance that would be undetectable in a standard postmortem toxicology screen, something that would perfectly mimic the symptoms of natural death. A massive, undetectable bolus of insulin. A carefully administered dose of potassium chloride to stop the heart. A fast-acting paralytic like succinylcholine. The list of possibilities was long and terrifying. Without an exhumation and a highly specific and expensive set of tox screens, they would never be able to prove poison. And he knew, with a sinking feeling, that he would never get a judge to sign off on exhuming a dozen bodies based on statistical anomalies alone. They were stuck. They were circling a predator. They could see her shadow in the data. They could hear the echo of her presence in the family's stories. But they couldn't touch her. They needed her to make a mistake. The break, when it came, was from the most unlikely and overlooked of sources. A young, observant janitor at the hospital, a man named Leo who had worked the night shift for 5 years, was brought in for a routine, peripheral interview about the unit's protocols. He was nervous, intimidated, but he had a keen eye for the small details that were out of place in his highly ordered world. He told Harding something interesting, something that made the hairs on the back of the detective's neck stand up. "Nurse Hayes, she's very particular, you know?" Leo said, nervously wringing his hands. "A real professional." She always cleans and sterilizes her own nursing station at the end of her shift. Wipes everything down herself. Most nurses, they just leave it for us. But there's this one thing. Every Tuesday and Thursday, just before her shift ends, around 6:45 a.m., she takes a small, separate trash bag from her personal locker. She ties it up real tight, and she disposes of it herself in the main incinerator chute down in the basement. It's against protocol, you see. We're supposed to handle all the medical waste from the floor. But nobody questions her. I mean, she's Nurse Hayes. A separate trash bag. Disposed of personally, in secret. It was a small, almost insignificant deviation in a life of otherwise perfect control and adherence to rules. It was the potential mistake Harding had been desperately waiting for. He knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as it was terrifying, that whatever Catherine Hayes was using to kill her patients was leaving that hospital in a small, anonymous plastic trash bag twice a week. The problem was, he couldn't just intercept it. He couldn't just wait for her in the basement. He needed a warrant, and he still didn't have enough to get one. He had to catch her in the act, or find the source of her deadly supply. Their investigation had just been given a new, sharp focus. They were no longer just looking for a ghost in the patient data. They were now hunting for a physical object, the single, tangible key that would unlock the entire, monstrous case. The hidden medicine bottle. The janitor's observation about the secret, personally disposed trash bag became the central, obsessive focus of the entire investigation. It was the first tangible, physical crack in Catherine Hayes's flawless facade of selfless compassion. For Detective Harding, it was a scent, the first real sign of a trail he could follow through the sterile, disorienting wilderness of the hospital. The challenge, however, was immense. How to intercept what was in that bag without a warrant, without tipping off their highly intelligent and hypervigilant suspect, a woman who operated with the quiet, predatory patience of a spider in her own meticulously constructed web. Their first attempt was a clumsy, almost comical failure that highlighted the difficulty of their task. They tried to place a GPS tracker on Catherine's modest sedan, hoping she might be taking the bag to a secondary disposal site. But she was too careful, her routine too insulated. She parked in a secure, camera-monitored employee garage deep in the bowels of the hospital. Any attempt to access her vehicle by an unauthorized person would be logged, would trigger an alert, and would undoubtedly warn her that she was being watched. They were trying to catch a spider, and she had woven a web of perfect, predictable routine that was, in itself, a fortress. Their next strategy was more subtle and far more technical. Chan, a digital native who could navigate the labyrinthine world of hospital IT systems with an intuitive grace, used her considerable skills to get a surreptitious, backdoor look at the hospital's pharmacy logs. She was hunting for discrepancies, for any unusual or unaccounted for withdrawals of drugs that could be used as untraceable murder weapons: potassium chloride, insulin, fast-acting paralytics like succinylcholine. But Catherine was, once again, too smart for that. The pharmacy's inventory control system at St. Jude's was state-of-the-art. Every single dose of a scheduled substance was tracked, its withdrawal digitally logged, requiring a doctor's electronic signature and a specific patient's name. Chun spent 2 sleepless nights combing through months of data. The logs were pristine. She wasn't stealing the drugs from the hospital's own supply. She was sourcing them from somewhere else, a place outside the hospital's tightly controlled ecosystem. This realization both deepened the mystery and heightened Harding's grudging, professional respect for his quarry. She was not an impulsive, emotional killer, lashing out in a fit of passion. She was a meticulous planner, a true ghost in the machine, a professional who understood the intricate system she operated within and knew exactly how to exploit its blind spots and its inherent trust. The investigation, by necessity, shifted its focus to her life outside the hospital. They put a quiet, round-the-clock surveillance on her small, unassuming apartment building. They watched her movements, logged her comings and goings. Her life was a monument to bland, unremarkable routine. She went to the hospital for her shifts. She came home. She went to the same grocery store once a week, on Saturday mornings. She occasionally visited the public library on Sunday afternoons. There were no clandestine meetings in shadowy parking garages, no suspicious, cash-only purchases from shady characters. She was a ghost in her own life, a woman who seemed to have no discernible passions, vices, or secrets. Harding was growing increasingly frustrated. The pressure from the district attorney's office to either produce concrete results or drop the politically and socially sensitive investigation was mounting daily. He felt like he was chasing a phantom, a creature made of statistics and shadows. The pattern of deaths was undeniable, but without a body, a weapon, and a direct physical link between the two, he had nothing but a horrifying, unprovable theory. He decided it was time to take a gamble, a classic, old-school piece of police work that went against every modern rule of covert investigation. He decided to try and rattle her cage. He and Chen arranged an official, formal interview with Nurse Hayes at the hospital. The official reason was a routine administrative review of palliative care protocols and patient outcomes following the recent, statistically unusual string of deaths. The meeting took place in a small, sterile, windowless conference room on the administrative floor, the air thick with the antiseptic smell of the hospital and a palpable, unspoken tension. Catherine was the very picture of calm, professional concern. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture perfect, her expression one of thoughtful sincerity. She answered their questions with detailed, insightful responses, drawing on her years of experience. She spoke of the immense emotional toll of her work, of her deep, abiding respect for the sanctity of her patients' final days. She expressed her own profound sadness at the recent losses. "It comes in waves, sometimes," she said, her soft, compassionate brown eyes full of a profound, utterly convincing empathy. "It's the hardest part of this job. You get so close to them, to their families. They become a part of your own family. And then you have to say goodbye over and over again." Harding watched her, studying her micro-expressions, her breathing, the subtle shifts in her body language. She was flawless. There was no flicker of fear, no hint of deception, no telltale signs of a liar. She was either a consummate, Oscar-worthy actress, or she was a complete and total innocent, and he was on the verge of destroying the career of a truly dedicated and wonderful nurse. Then he made his move. He let a moment of silence hang in the air, then leaned forward, his voice casual, almost an afterthought. "We've been looking at the toxicology reports from the recent deaths, Nurse Hayes," he said, his eyes locked on hers. It was a complete and utter bluff. There were no specialized tox reports. "We're running some more advanced, specialized screenings just to be thorough. On Mr. Thorne specifically. Dr. Petrova, you see, was a bit puzzled by the suddenness of his decline. For the barest fraction of a second, a nanosecond of time that only a detective trained for years to observe would have noticed, something flickered in the calm, compassionate depths of her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something colder, sharper. It was calculation. A brief, almost imperceptible tightening around her mouth, a subtle stiffening of her spine. Then, it was gone, as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a look of polite, professional curiosity. "Oh," she said, her voice a perfect note of mild interest. "That is interesting. I certainly hope you find something that can help us understand it better. Any new information that can improve patient care and bring peace of mind to the families is always welcome." She had not taken the bait, but she had seen it. Harding knew with absolute certainty that he had just warned her. He had just walked up to the spider and told her that he was in her web. It was a colossal, career-ending risk. It could make her stop, go dormant, and they would lose her forever in the quiet, statistical noise of the hospital. Or it could make her nervous. And nervous people, no matter how brilliant or meticulous, make mistakes. The night after the interview, the surveillance team stationed in a van outside her apartment building reported something new. For the first time in the weeks they had been watching her, Catherine Hayes deviated from her rigid, predictable routine. At 2 a.m., hours after her shift had ended and the city had fallen into a deep slumber, she left her apartment. She was carrying a small, heavy-looking black gym bag. She got into her car and drove, not towards the hospital or any known location, but to a quiet, desolate, industrial part of the city, an area of abandoned warehouses and crumbling, graffiti-covered factories. She parked her car, her eyes scanning the dark, empty streets to ensure she wasn't being followed. She walked to a large, rusted public dumpster behind a derelict textile mill. She opened the heavy lid, dropped the gym bag inside, and drove away, disappearing back into the night. The surveillance team, their hearts pounding, moved in as soon as she was gone. Inside the dumpster, amidst the rotting garbage, they found the bag. It was not filled with gym clothes. It was filled with dozens upon dozens of empty, multi-dose vials of a very specific and very telling drug, digoxin. Back at the precinct, in the early hours of the morning, Chen's fingers flew across her keyboard. Digoxin was a powerful cardiac medication, a digitalis glycoside, used to treat certain types of heart failure and arrhythmias. In therapeutic doses, it was a lifesaver. In a massive, unchecked overdose, however, it was a lethal and brutally effective poison. It would cause a massive, unstoppable heart attack, a catastrophic cardiac event. And most importantly, in a patient like the recently deceased Mrs. Vance, who already had congestive heart failure and was being treated with the drug, a standard postmortem toxicology screen would simply show elevated levels of a drug she was already prescribed. It wouldn't necessarily read as a poison. It would read as a tragic, accidental overdose or a natural, if sudden, complication of her underlying disease. It was the perfect, nearly undetectable murder weapon for a hospital setting. The vials were untraceable, their lot numbers and identifying pharmaceutical marks meticulously and painstakingly scratched off with a sharp tool. She had been stockpiling them for some time. But where was she getting them? Harding's mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle finally, rapidly, clicking into place. The janitor had said she disposed of a bag at the hospital after every shift. But after his interview, after his bluff, she had changed her routine. She had panicked and disposed of her larger, incriminating stockpile offsite. The bluff had worked. He had scared her. She was cleaning house. But that meant the small, single bag, the one she disposed of after every shift, was still in play. That bag, he reasoned with a surge of adrenaline, must contain the single, used vial from that night's work, along with the syringe she used to administer the fatal dose. That was the evidence he needed. That was the smoking gun that would tie her directly to a specific victim. He now had enough probable cause. He went back to Judge Fletcher, this time not with a hunch, but with a solid, compelling chain of evidence. The chilling statistical pattern, the suspicious behavior reported by the janitor, the calculated change in her routine after his interview, and the discovery of the massive, illegally obtained digoxin stockpile. He got the warrant. The plan was set for the following Tuesday night, Catherine's next scheduled shift. Harding and a small, hand-picked team of plainclothes officers would be inside the hospital. They would wait. They would watch her every move. Their target was not the nurse herself, but the small, secret bag of trash she would be carrying at the end of her shift. The entire, sprawling 18-month investigation, the fate of dozens of silent victims, now came down to a single, tense night of waiting and the contents of one little plastic bag. The air on the 4th floor of St. Jude's Mercy Hospital on that Tuesday night was thick with a tense, unnatural silence that was palpable only to those who knew its cause. For the patients, lost in their own worlds of pain and medication, and for most of the unsuspecting staff, it was just another quiet, routine night shift. But for Detective Harding and his team, hidden in plain sight throughout the ward, it was the final, high-stakes act of a long and harrowing play. Harding, dressed in the rumpled, grief-stricken attire of a concerned family member, sat a grim, silent vigil in an empty room at the far end of the main corridor, a vantage point that gave him a clear view of the central nursing station. Chen, her face partially obscured by a surgical mask, was dressed in scrubs, posing as a floating nurse from another floor, observing the subtle ebb and flow of the unit's activity. 2 other plainclothes officers were positioned near the main stairwells and the service corridor that led to the basement. Every one of them was wired for sound, their quiet, professional voices a ghostly counterpoint to the soft beeps and hums of the medical equipment. Catherine Hayes moved through the hushed, dimly lit corridors like a ghost, a beacon of calm and unwavering competence. She administered medications with a gentle, practiced hand. She checked vitals, her touch light and reassuring. She spoke in soothing, hushed tones to the anxious and the frightened. Watching her through the crack in the door, Harding felt a profound, chilling sense of cognitive dissonance. He was witnessing a master performer, a woman whose mask of selfless compassion was so perfect, so seamless, that it was impossible to see the cold, calculating monster lurking just beneath the surface. The night wore on, each deliberate tick of the institutional clock on the wall a small, percussive beat in the slow, mounting tension. Around 3 a.m., a call light flashed from room 412. It was the room of a gentle, elderly man named Mr. Peterson, a retired schoolteacher with late-stage emphysema. His breathing, already labored, had become shallow, his heart monitor beginning to flash with an erratic, alarming rhythm. A code blue was called over the intercom, but not with the usual frantic life-or-death urgency of the ER. It was a palliative care code, a more subdued and somber affair, focused on comfort rather than resuscitation. Catherine was the first to respond, her movements calm, efficient, and utterly composed, a study in professional grace under the most intense pressure. From his vantage point, Harding could only hear the clipped, professional dialogue over the wire, a tense, whispered drama playing out in his earpiece. He heard Catherine's firm, reassuring voice directing the other, younger nurses. He heard her call out a series of medications, a small dose of morphine for pain and anxiety, a dose of Ativan to ease his agitation. He heard her say she was administering them, ostensibly to make Mr. Peterson more comfortable in his final, struggling moments. And then, a few minutes later, he heard the long, final, unbroken tone of the heart monitor, a sound that cut through the quiet of the ward like a razor. Mr. Peterson was gone. Harding watched as Catherine emerged from the room a few minutes later, her face a perfect mask of somber, professional grief. She spoke in low, comforting tones to the other nurses, reassuring them that they had done everything they could. Then, she walked to the nursing station and made the difficult, heartbreaking call to the family. Her performance was, as always, flawless. She was the grieving angel, the compassionate caregiver who had just lost another beloved patient, another member of her hospital family. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of quiet paperwork and subdued, respectful routine. Then, at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before her shift was due to end, Catherine Hayes did exactly what the janitor had described, exactly what Harding and his team had been waiting for all night. She went to her personal locker, retrieved her handbag, and from it, she produced a small, rolled-up, black plastic bag, no bigger than her fist. She walked, not to the designated, red biohazard medical waste bins, but towards the quiet, deserted service corridor that led to the basement incinerator chute. "She's on the move," Chen's voice crackled in Harding's earpiece. "East Service Corridor, heading for the basement access." Harding moved to intercept her. He stepped out of the empty room and met her in the quiet, sterile corridor, the air smelling of bleach and floor wax. She looked up, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw a flicker of genuine, unscripted surprise in her eyes, followed by a flash of cold, primal animal fear. The mask was finally, irrevocably slipping. "Nurse Hayes," Harding said, his voice quiet but as unyielding as granite. He held up the search warrant, the paper a stark, white flag of surrender in the dim hallway. "I'll be taking that bag." She clutched the small bag to her chest, a primal, protective gesture, as if it were her own child. For a long, tense moment he thought she might run, might scream, might fight. But then, as the reality of her situation settled in, a strange, almost serene calm washed over her features. The fear was gone, replaced by a look of weary, almost peaceful resignation. She knew the performance was over. The final curtain had fallen. Without a single word, she extended her hand and gave the bag to him. Inside, nestled in a crumpled, used tissue, was exactly what he had expected to find. A single empty 10 milliliters vial of digoxin and a used, capped syringe. The label on this vial, unlike the ones from the